I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, though the room felt warm, almost stifling. The polished wooden benches gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the smell of old paper and floor polish hung in the air. My hands rested on the table in front of me, fingers interlocked to stop them from shaking. Across the room, my daughter sat with her lawyer. She didn't look at me, not even once. Her eyes were fixed on the papers in front of her, as if reading them over and over could shield her from the weight of what was about to happen. I wanted to believe that somewhere deep inside, she still remembered the sound of my voice telling her bedtime stories, or the way I used to carry her on my shoulders. But here, in this room, she was someone else, distant, guarded, and cold. The murmur of conversation died down when the bailiff entered, his voice sharp and commanding. We all rose to our feet. The door behind the bench opened, and the judge stepped in. Black robe, silver hair, eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He didn't smile, didn't nod, he simply took his seat and began scanning the files laid before him. My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. This was it. Months of tension, sleepless nights, and unanswered questions had led to this one moment. In this room, with its stiff chairs and quiet desperation, my future, and whatever was left of my relationship with my daughter, would be decided. He adjusted his glasses and looked up from the stack of documents. For a moment, his eyes swept the room, moving from the attorneys to the few people seated in the back. Then they landed on me. It wasn't the kind of glance you can shrug off. It was steady, deliberate, like he was measuring something I couldn't quite name. There was no warmth in it, but there wasn't hostility either. Just a deep, searching stillness, as if he could see the weight I carried on my shoulders. Then his gaze shifted to my daughter. I watched as her posture straightened under the weight of his attention. For the first time that morning, she glanced in my direction, though only for a heartbeat. Her eyes held no trace of the girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and tangled hair. Instead, there was resolve, cold, unshakable resolve. The judge's eyes moved back to the file in front of him. He tapped his pen against the paper, slow and rhythmic, before speaking. His voice was calm, but each word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, making my chest feel heavier. I realized then that this wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an examination of who we had become. Two people who had once been inseparable, now standing on opposite sides of an invisible line, waiting for someone else to decide which story would be believed. It's strange how life can unravel without you noticing at first. There was a time when my daughter and I were more than just family, we were each other's safe place. I remember long drives with the windows down, her hair whipping around as she laughed, pointing at shapes in the clouds. I remember her small hand gripping mine when she was nervous, like she believed I could shield her from anything. But somewhere along the way, small cracks began to form. At first, it was the distance that comes when children grow up, new friends, new priorities, a life of her own. I accepted that, thinking it was natural. I told myself I would always be a quiet constant in her life, waiting for the moments she needed me. Then, life threw storms at us. The loss of her mother hit us both hard, but in different ways. I tried to be strong, but grief has a way of twisting the way you speak, the way you look, the way you exist. We misread each other's silences. My attempts to protect her from pain sometimes came across as control. Her attempts to assert independence sometimes felt like rejection. And yet, I never imagined we would end up here, facing each other in a courtroom, each side armed with lawyers and paperwork, trying to prove who was right, as if love could be weighed like evidence. Before everything soured, there were years that felt golden. I can still picture her as a little girl, curled up on the living room couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes wide as I read her stories. She'd laugh at the same parts every time, even when she knew exactly what was coming. Summers were our favorite. We'd spend entire afternoons at the park, her chasing after butterflies while I sat under the shade of an old oak tree, pretending to read but really just watching her. On hot days, we'd stop for ice cream, and she'd always choose strawberry, her lips and tongue stained pink. Sometimes she'd fall asleep in the car on the way home, her head leaning against the window, the sun painting her face in gold. Even as she got older, we had our little traditions. Friday night dinners, just the two of us. Saturday morning pancakes, where she insisted on flipping them herself, even if they came out misshapen. She'd tell me about her friends, her dreams, her fears. Back then, she shared everything. I knew her voice, her laughter, even her silences. Those were the days I thought would last forever. The kind of memories you don't just store away, they become part of you, like the very air you breathe. I never imagined that one day, they'd feel like fragments of a life that belonged to someone else. It was subtle at first, so subtle I almost convinced myself it was nothing. She began answering my calls a little less often, saying she was busy with work or friends. When we did talk, the conversations felt shorter, as if she was always halfway out the door, her mind somewhere else. One evening, I stopped by her apartment to drop off a small gift I'd found, something that reminded me of a trip we once took together. She opened the door, smiled politely, but didn't invite me in. I told myself it was because she was tired, maybe not feeling well. Still, that night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The changes kept coming. She stopped telling me about the small details of her life, the kinds of things she used to share without thinking. I'd hear about big events days after they happened, sometimes from other people. Our Friday dinners became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. I remember sitting alone one Friday night, the table set for two, the food going cold. I stared at my phone, hoping for a message, an explanation. But it never came. I told myself it was just a phase. Deep down, though, I knew it was the beginning of something I didn't know how to stop. Some wounds don't come from what's said, they come from what isn't. The silences between us began to stretch longer, turning into walls I couldn't see over. When she did speak, her tone was polite, careful, almost as if she were talking to a stranger. There were moments when her choice of words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were stripped of any trace of affection. "I'll let you know if I have time," instead of "I can't wait to see you." "I'm fine," instead of telling me what was really going on. Once, during a family gathering, I tried to join a conversation she was having with her friends. She didn't say anything unkind, but the way she avoided my eyes, the way her body shifted slightly away from me, made it clear I wasn't part of her world anymore. It's strange how the absence of warmth can hurt more than anger. If she had yelled, I could have argued back. If she had accused me, I could have defended myself. But this quiet withdrawal left me with nothing to fight against. I was left standing in the shadows of a relationship that once felt like the brightest light in my life. It was a Sunday afternoon when I found out. A distant cousin had called to ask if I'd seen the pictures online, photos of a celebration at my daughter's home. Balloons, laughter, family, friends, and me, nowhere in sight. I hadn't heard a word about it. No call, no text, no casual mention the last time we spoke. At first, I thought maybe it was a small gathering, something spontaneous. But as I scrolled through the photos, I saw the decorations, the catered food, the smiling faces. This wasn't last minute. It had been planned. Carefully. The truth hit like a slow, cold wave. She hadn't wanted me there. My mind kept searching for reasons. Maybe she thought I was busy, maybe it was just for her friends. But deep down, I knew. I was no longer part of the inner circle of her life. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at my phone, reading and rereading our last few messages, looking for a hint, a clue, anything that could explain why. But there was nothing. Just polite exchanges, surface-level words. The kind you send to someone you keep at a distance. It wasn't the absence of the invitation that hurt the most, it was realizing she hadn't even thought I would expect one. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the afternoon light spilling through the blinds, pen in hand. I'd decided that if phone calls felt awkward and visits were no longer welcome, maybe a letter could bridge the gap. I wanted it to be more than just words, I wanted her to feel my heart in every line. I wrote about memories we shared, about the pride I felt watching her grow into the woman she'd become. I admitted my mistakes, times I'd been stubborn, moments I wished I could redo. I told her I missed her, that I was here, that no matter the distance, she would always have a home in me. I mailed it the same day, imagining her finding it in her mailbox, maybe pausing in her busy life to read it. I pictured her smiling softly, maybe even picking up the phone to call me. Days passed. Then weeks. No reply. Not a call, not a text, not even a short note to acknowledge she'd received it. At first, I told myself it might have gotten lost. But one evening, scrolling through social media, I saw she'd been active, posting pictures, responding to friends. She had simply chosen silence. There's a unique kind of ache in knowing your words have reached someone's hands, but not their heart. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked among the usual pile of bills and advertisements. A thick envelope with an official seal. My name typed neatly on the front, the return address from the county courthouse. I stood in my kitchen holding it, a strange heaviness settling in my chest. Part of me wanted to set it down, pretend it wasn't there. But my hands moved on their own, tearing it open. Inside, the words were cold, formal, stripped of any emotion, an order to appear in court. My daughter's name was there too, but not in the way I ever wanted to see it. She wasn't writing to me. She was taking legal action against me. I read it twice, my eyes catching on the same phrases over and over: petition filed, respondent, court date. It felt unreal, like I was reading about someone else's life. But it was mine. I tried to imagine her, sitting across from an attorney, explaining why she wanted to bring me here. Did her voice tremble? Did she feel any hesitation? Or had she already closed the door in her heart so tightly that this felt like the only path forward? The paper slipped from my hands onto the table, but the weight of it stayed in my chest. I knew this was no misunderstanding. This was the point of no return. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. My lawyer, a man in his 50s with kind eyes but a sharp mind, gestured for me to sit. He had already read the petition. His desk was neat, except for the thick file that now carried my name. He spoke plainly, without sugarcoating. "This won't be easy," he said, sliding the papers toward me. "She's making claims that will require a strong response. We need facts, timelines, and any evidence you have." As he outlined the strategy, my mind kept drifting. I wasn't thinking about dates or documents, I was thinking about her. About the way her name looked in that legal font, stripped of all the warmth it once carried for me. I told him everything I could remember, from the first signs of distance to the moments I thought we might still reconcile. He took notes quickly, asking pointed questions, sometimes pausing to choose the right words. When the meeting ended, he handed me a list of things to gather: records, messages, anything that could help. I tucked it into my jacket pocket, feeling the weight of the responsibility and the deeper weight of what this all meant. Walking out into the cool air, I realized this was no longer just about misunderstandings or hurt feelings. It was about winning or losing in a place where emotions didn't count, only proof did. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room the only sound breaking the silence. Every time I closed my eyes, memories tangled with fears: her as a little girl laughing in the backyard, and then her in the courtroom, looking through me as if I were a stranger. I kept going over my statement in my head, trying to imagine how it would sound when read aloud. Would it make her pause, even for a second? Would it reach her the way my letter never did? Or would it just bounce off the wall she had built between us? The clock on my nightstand glowed 2:17 a.m., then 3:41, then 4:26. I got up and made coffee, though I didn't need the caffeine. My nerves were enough to keep me awake for a week. I ironed my shirt twice, shined my shoes, packed my documents into a worn leather folder. The ritual gave me something to do with my hands, but it didn't calm the storm inside me. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I realized the day had come. The moment I dreaded and prepared for in equal measure. By this time tomorrow, something between us would be irrevocably different, whether for better or worse, I didn't know. When I stepped inside, the air felt heavier than it had during my last visit. The sound of footsteps on the polished floor echoed in a way that made every movement seem amplified. People spoke in low voices, careful not to disturb the weight of the moment. I took my seat at the table my lawyer had chosen, placing my folder neatly in front of me. Across the aisle, my daughter sat beside her attorney. She was dressed in muted colors, her hair pulled back, her face composed. She didn't glance at me. Not once. The room filled slowly, clerks, a few spectators, the bailiff standing tall by the door. But even with all those bodies present, there was a stillness, as if we were all holding our breath. I became aware of the smallest sounds: the shuffle of papers, the faint creak of a chair, the quiet click of a pen. My heartbeat felt so loud I was certain it could be heard. When the bailiff finally announced the judge's arrival, everyone stood. The scrape of chairs against the floor was the only break in the hush. And when the judge entered, his black robe flowing behind him, the silence seemed to deepen, thick and unbroken, like a curtain lowering before the play begins. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, smoothing the front of her skirt as if to steady herself. Her lawyer gave her a reassuring nod, and then she began. Her voice was calm, clear, almost too clear. Every word was measured, chosen with precision. She spoke of moments I remembered entirely differently, painting them in shades that made me sound like someone I barely recognized. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't angry, she was composed, almost detached. And somehow, that hurt more than rage ever could. I searched her face for a flicker of emotion, something that might betray doubt or hesitation. But her eyes stayed fixed on the judge, as if I wasn't even in the room. There were truths in what she said, but they were half-truths, stripped of the context that once gave them meaning. Little pieces of our life, rearranged until they told a story where I was no longer the father who had carried her on his shoulders or stayed up all night when she was sick, but instead a figure she needed to defend herself against. When she finished, she sat back down, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't look at me, not even for a second. When the judge signaled that it was my turn, I didn't rise to speak. Instead, I handed him the envelope I had prepared, a written statement I'd spent weeks crafting. My lawyer had advised me to let the words stand on their own, unshaken by nerves or interruptions. Inside those pages was my truth, not the polished language of legal strategy, but the raw, unfiltered account of what had brought us here. I had written about the nights I stayed awake worrying about her, the sacrifices I made quietly, without asking for thanks. I admitted the mistakes I had made, because no parent is without them, but I also described the love that had never left me, even when she did. I'd chosen my words carefully, not to win sympathy from the court, but in the small, fragile hope that they might reach her heart. Every sentence carried pieces of our past, the laughter, the long drives, the shared meals, and the deep ache of watching those moments fade into something distant and cold. As the judge began to read, I watched his eyes move across the page, his expression unreadable. My daughter didn't look up. She kept her gaze on her folded hands, as if the words on that paper were a language she no longer understood. The room seemed to shrink as the judge's voice filled it, steady and deliberate. Each word felt heavier than when I had written it, as if speaking them aloud gave them new weight. I kept my eyes on my daughter, hoping for some reaction, a glance, a shift in her posture, anything. But she sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of her breathing. When he read the parts about her childhood, the park, the ice cream, the nights of laughter, I thought I saw her shoulders tense ever so slightly. But just as quickly, she seemed to retreat back into herself, the wall between us unshaken. The judge didn't rush. He paused at certain lines, as if considering them carefully. The sound of paper turning was the only break in his voice. My heart pounded in my ears, and I found myself holding my breath, as though the outcome depended on whether I exhaled. For a few moments, it was as if time stopped. Just the judge's voice, the echo of my own words, and the silent distance between a father and his daughter. When the judge finished reading, he set the papers down with deliberate care. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving first to me, then to my daughter. The pause was long enough for my pulse to quicken, my mouth dry. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words struck with the force of a hammer. "You've won," he said, turning to my daughter. The sound of it seemed to hang in the air, as though the room itself needed a moment to absorb it. My lawyer shifted in his seat beside me, but I didn't move. I just stared at the judge, then at her. She didn't smile, didn't show any visible triumph. She only gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. For her, maybe it was just the end of a process, the closing of a chapter. For me, it felt like the slamming of a door I'd been holding open for years. The bailiff moved to collect the documents, the attorneys began packing their files, and life in the courtroom resumed its usual rhythm. But inside me, everything had gone still. Those two words, "You've won," echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help wondering if either of us had truly gained anything at all. It didn't hit me all at once. At first, the words felt distant, like they had been spoken in another room. But then, as the shuffle of papers and low murmurs filled the courtroom, the meaning seeped in, slow and sharp, like a blade sliding between the ribs. It wasn't about legal victory or loss anymore. It was about what those words represented. You've won. If she had won, then I had lost. And it wasn't just a case, it was her. I had lost her. Memories began flashing through my mind, uninvited and relentless, her tiny hand holding mine on the first day of school, the sound of her laughter when I pushed her on the swing, the way she used to say Dad with that upward lilt, like it was the safest word she knew. All of it felt suddenly out of reach, as if I'd been locked out of a home I once built with my own hands. My chest ached, but it wasn't the kind of pain you can rub away. It was deep, hidden in places no one could see. The kind that doesn't bruise the skin but leaves marks just the same. I told myself not to cry, not here, not now. But inside, I felt the slow, crushing collapse of something I thought could never truly break. When the judge adjourned the session, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor broke the heavy stillness. People began to file out, speaking in hushed tones, their footsteps echoing against the high walls. I gathered my papers slowly, giving myself a moment before standing. My hands moved automatically, stacking documents, tucking them into the folder, but my mind was somewhere else, still caught in the echo of those two words, "You've won." My daughter rose without looking at me. She exchanged a quiet word with her lawyer, then walked toward the exit. For a split second, I thought she might glance back. She didn't. The corridor outside the courtroom was long and dim, lined with portraits of judges from decades past. I walked it like someone moving underwater, each step heavy, muffled. The double doors at the end opened to a rush of cool air and the noise of the street outside, car horns, voices, the hum of life going on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something irreversible. And as I stepped out into the daylight, I realized I was carrying not just a legal defeat, but the weight of a goodbye that had never been spoken. The days that followed felt strangely hollow. No ringing phone. No unexpected knock at the door. Just the usual hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, and the occasional car passing outside. I thought maybe I'd wake up one morning and feel anger, something sharp enough to push me forward. But it never came. Instead, there was only a quiet ache, an emptiness that settled into the house like dust in the corners. I avoided looking at the table where we once shared meals, at the photo frames on the shelf that still held her smile. They felt like relics from a time that no longer belonged to me. Even simple things, making coffee, folding laundry, felt different, as if I were doing them in someone else's home. Some nights, I would catch myself listening for a message alert, some sign that she'd reached out, even just to say hello. But the silence was steady, unbroken. It wasn't the kind of silence that waits to be filled, it was the kind that tells you no words are coming. And so I learned to live with it, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. In the weeks that followed, I realized that some things fade quietly, while others stay rooted deep inside you, refusing to let go. The warmth of her laughter, the feel of her hand in mine when she was small, those remain, etched in me like carvings that time can't erase. But the everyday closeness, the casual calls, the shared meals, those have slipped away, like photographs left too long in the sun. I can't force them back. I can only carry what's left and keep walking. I don't know if she'll ever see me the way she once did. I don't know if the distance will ever close. But I do know this: love doesn't vanish just because it isn't returned. It lives quietly, sometimes painfully, inside the one who still feels it. Maybe someday she'll remember, not the courtroom, not the papers, but the man who stood by her side when the world felt too big. And maybe that will be enough. If you've listened to my story and it touched you in any way, I'd be grateful if you could click the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach more people who might need to hear them.